The fluorescent lights hummed with a tired, steady rhythm that matched the slow sweep of Grant Miller's mop. He moved without hurry, practicing as if the motion itself might smooth the rough edges of the day. The Rose City Dojo was empty at this hour. Only the smell of rubber mats and old sweat kept him company. He allowed himself the small luxury of listening for Gideon's clock in the corner. Ticks like a metronome for a life he had rearranged around one unshakable rule: keep Piper safe, keep the past under glass. His hands were big in a way that had once been an advantage. Now those hands held a sponge, a towel, a chipped mug he never threw away because Piper liked its faded cartoon cat. He wiped circles until the mat shone like a small, shallow pond. In the overhead lights, he could still see the phantom of a fight, the footwork, the pivot, the way timing could turn an opponent's momentum into a question. That version of him had a name on the marquee once: Phantom. 5 championship belts, a nickname that fit like armor. He had walked away because armor rusted, and because one mistake had been enough to break everything. Piper's school backpack was always slung over one shoulder when she came to the dojo on afternoons Grant had asked for. She would trail him through the ritual of closing, double-locking the front door, stacking chairs, making sure the kettle was on for tea. She had 10 years of earnest inside her. She believed in small things the way some people believe in miracles. Tonight she was waiting for him at the little apartment above the gym, the one they could afford because Grant timed his shifts to coincide with classes and odd jobs. The radiator wheezed protestations as he climbed the stairs 2 at a time, the mop bucket sloshing like a bell. "Did you win anything today?" Piper asked before she even saw him, voice full of courtly expectation. She had a grin all ready for the minor competitions of their household. Who could fold laundry nicer, who could do the higher jump into bed. Grant closed the door and let the city noise slip in like distant rain. The apartment smelled of cinnamon and a boxed cake mix because Piper wanted to make a small victory cake for her teacher's birthday. She had placed 2 paper crowns on the kitchen table, one for the teacher and one, obviously, for Dad. "You beat Tyler," she said, helping him take off his jacket. Grant kept his face neutral. It was easier all the time now to be modest by habit. "Tyler's loud," he said. "Loud people make a lot of noise. Doesn't mean they're better." "You're my champion," she announced with solemn gravity, as though it were a legal declaration in a court of joyful things. She tucked a stray curl behind his ear like a small coronation. He felt the old reflexive flinch and then the warmth that made his ribs ache. "Champion who steals frosting," he said, and they both laughed. He let Piper crow about the stolen frosting like it was evidence of a thriving domestic conspiracy, small, important rebellions. Their life ran on these domestic anchors: a scraped knee, a grade report, pumpkin seeds roasted for no reason at all. Grant studied the shapes of his daughter's face as a cartographer studies a coastline, every freckle a point to navigate. Protecting her had become a practice that wore him out and brought him peace in equal measure. He had built a small world precisely and carefully to exclude the thing that had scared him most: the ring. There were nights when he still woke with the smell of antiseptic and the sound of the referee's whistle cutting the air. It had been 2 years since the accident, 3 since he stopped going by Phantom, and sometimes the past bled into the present in staccato images. The snap of a joint, a phone vibrating beside a hospital bed, Jack's laugh the last thing he heard before everything went wrong. He had promised himself the quiet life after that. He had promised Jack he would stop before anything like that could ever happen again. Rose City Dojo relied on a reputation Grant had helped sustain in quieter days. Tyler Rhodes, who ran most of the evening classes, had ambition that ballooned to the edges of his behavior. He liked the sound of his own authority. He liked, even more, to belittle the janitor who cleaned up the space that allowed his classes to exist. Tyler's students saw him as exemplary because he was loud with certainty. That certainty paid for pride in a city that liked the look of winners. The morning the limousine rolled up, Grant was bailing water from a leaky kettle beneath a heat lamp. It was December, on the cusp of the season that made the world look softer and stern at once. And boxes of donated coats were stacked like surrendered flags near the entrance. Someone had arranged a corporate outreach, a holiday drive with logos Grant did not bother to learn. He had been told nothing except to have the gym ready and the kids' program scheduled at noon. The car that stopped on the curb was dark glass and shine. It breathed wealth in the language the city notices. Reflections like black mirrors, a chauffeur who smiled at none of them, the whisper of custom leather. A woman stepped out like an image forced into reality. Her coat was wool and structured so that it seemed to build a small private barrier. She wore a scarf that was more an accent than a warmth. She walked with a certainty of steps that had been rehearsed and never questioned. Victoria Langley watched everything as if cataloging for a ledger. She was 32, precise, and used to outcomes aligning with plans. She had been sent because somebody in the family's philanthropy office thought community goodwill and holiday optics required the touch of an heiress. Victoria had given in because part of her still liked boxes being checked, lists being completed. Real life demanded less polish than the boardroom, but she had carefully curated an indifference that kept people from reaching the parts of her that were unfinished and asking for explanations. From the doorway of the dojo, she saw the class starting. Kids in rented gloves practicing footwork, teens learning to hold their center. Tyler at the middle like a man at the prow, big in his own telling. She watched Grant move past with the mop across the mats, the way his sleeve dampened at the cuff. He did not look like the stories she'd been furnished about fighters, no tattoos, no swagger, but the way he straightened a mat, the way he placed a misplaced water bottle with an almost invisible tenderness, made her turn her head with the small surprise curiosity reserved, on rare occasions, for things she could not buy. Tyler's voice carried across the mat the way a gavel would. "You there, what are you even doing? This is a dojo, not a museum. Pick up your pace." The words were clipped with a smile that had no warmth. Some of the teenagers laughed. Laughter is a social currency often paid to those in power. Grant set down the mop and squared his shoulders. He had spent years teaching Piper not to engage with taunts that aimed to stir the pot. He had learned, painfully, that any bait thrown at a man with a still raw past could reopen a wound not ready to be probed. Humiliation was a language he understood. He had learned its grammar to keep his daughter at a distance from it. He kept his voice flat, even. "I'm closing up, Tyler." Tyler's grin widened. "Oh, I'm not talking about closing up. I'm talking about the way you stand. You look like you slept on those mats. Do you even remember how to move?" A student raised a phone in the back, the tiny red light of a camera finding its way to the action like a moth. That single, modern gesture made Grant feel the past's cold shadow, because the internet kept and repeated images, and sometimes, once, it had been the wrong people recording the wrong moment. Grant could have walked away. He could have collected the mop and left the gym in his practiced anonymity. The part of him that still knew weight and balance and leverage had, however, learned another lesson. Humility is never about proving nothing. It is about proving the right thing when it matters. He had promised himself never to let the ring define the rest of his life again, but promises are thin, and reality tugs at them like a tide. He stepped forward a measured pace, the way a man steps into a conversation he cannot let end badly. He looked Tyler in the eye, not with menace, but with a steady appraisal. "You want to see?" he asked. Tyler laughed the way an audience applauds a dove trick. "Please, show me." The demonstration came not as an explosion, but as a quiet, deliberate lesson. Grant asked Tyler to throw a basic jab, the sort that a beginner would offer as proof of aggression. He didn't throw his own weight into a counter. He never had, not since the day he had learned too late how much damage momentum could do. Instead, he used Tyler's motion. He made a small adjustment with the inside of his forearm to create a fulcrum at the man's elbow,
shifted his own center a half step to the left, and guided Tyler's punch wide. The effect was not cinematic impact, but the soft, incontrovertible physics of leverage. The attacker's force redirected until it had nowhere to go. Tyler's balance failed in the most human way. He tripped over his own attention, his feet no longer meeting the surface expected. He fell with a thud that made even the students go quiet. The mat didn't break him, his pride did. Someone's phone screen flashed. Someone in the front row who had once idolized Tyler now saw a man toppled. It was technical, not theatrical. Grant's hand had been at the intersection of Tyler's movement and gravity. A precision, a learned economy of effort. He did not strike, he taught. The class watched a man who had once been powerful reveal his craft as a lesson on the body's language. In the hush that followed, the world seemed to hold its breath for the verdict. Tyler pushed himself up, eyes bright with something he didn't know how to name. Shame lacquered with rage. "You set me up," he spat. Grant did not rise to that bait. He stayed down, offering his hand as if he believed in ordinary forgiveness as a daily currency. "You tripped on your own reach," he said simply. Somewhere in the back, the woman in the wool coat covered her mouth. Victoria Langley's face had softened in a way that was almost imperceptible, less armor than shudder in a storm. She had watched a man dismantle arrogance with gentleness, and it registered like a misfiled memo in the ledger she kept of people. She had been taught to value control and outcome. Here was someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, who nevertheless chose to convert force into a lesson. Her interest, which she routinely quarantined, uncoiled. The video of the fall would live on longer than the conversation. Phones were now modern graves and archives all at once. A student posted it with an embarrassed caption and a cluster of laughing emojis that stopped feeling joking in the wrong place. The clip did not show the full picture, how Grant had guided the movement, how his palm had cupped the elbow with the tenderness of a craftsman ensuring a tool's function. It showed a man falling and the janitor's hand in the air like a punctuation mark. The clip would be the match. It would hit the tinder of a town that loved a spectacle. Grant knew that public moments had consequences, whether you wanted them or not. He thought of Jack's face in a hospital corridor and felt the lack of control like a tuned instrument. He had chosen carefully to stay small enough to shield Piper. The video threatened that moat. After class, Tyler glared from the mats like a man who had been exposed.
"You're not some kind of teacher," Grant supplied, and his voice was even. "Just teacher." That evening, before they closed the front door to the world, Victoria Langley lingered at the coat table where she had signed her name on a clipboard as part of the outreach program. She felt a curiously domestic awareness watching the janitor and the man who had fallen trade glances that were already making the air around them smaller. It had the effect, on her, of dislocating something steady. She zipped her gloves carefully, an act of ritual that she rarely let herself do while thinking. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she allowed a softness into an observation, and it was unsettlingly pleasant. Grant walked the long way home that evening because the cold was a useful thing. It cleared the edges and kept his mind from being swallowed by itself. He tended to memory with the same measured attention he gave the mats. The accident with Jack lived in him like an ache that refused to be smoothed away, something that could be tended but never cured. The memory arrived in pieces. The roar of a crowd he hadn't chosen to be in, the bright white of far too many lights, the wrong shape of bodies moving. Jack had been younger than Grant by a year, and louder by 10. He had been the one to make them laugh during long weight cuts and early morning runs. They had had plans, a small bar to own, kids who learned to kick and throw and guard their edges. None of those plans mattered when a sparring session went off script because of a misread timing and a flinch. Jack had fallen wrong in the scramble. No maliciousness, no intent, a single moment where perfect practice had failed them. Grant had carried the image of Jack on the mat like a stone in his pocket. There had been lawyers and grief and the slow unspooling of friends into silence. He had left the sport because staying had felt like activation,
Walking away felt like registration of responsibility. The fact that he had not been punished by fans or by law did not dilute the weight. He had been both the man who could have stopped it sooner and the man who did not, a paradox he learned to live with. Piper's 10-year-old hand curled in his the way a barometer registers soft weather. "Dad," she asked at the kitchen table, face full of butter and cake crumbs, "did you ever get mad? Like really mad? Like with your fists?" Grant smiled because the world allowed small clarifications. "Sometimes," he said, "but being mad and doing something with that mad are two different things. I learned the hard way about the doing part." She leaned in like she was getting confidential information. "You could teach me how to be a champion without," her voice faltered at the edges, the way a child sometimes does when trying on adult terrors, "without hurting people." "We'll do better than that," he said. "We'll learn how to be strong enough to stop." There was a text from Mira. "Good turnout tomorrow.
Wear something warm. Bring extra gloves." Grant typed back a quick affirmative and placed his phone face down, choosing the real and small present conversation in front of him. In the back of his mind, the clip from earlier was a sleeping animal that might wake at any time. People wanted stories. The internet wanted tidy narratives, and those narratives tended to flatten complexity into shareable bits. He knew he had to be careful for Piper's sake. He had to be careful with his own heart. Meanwhile, in a suite far above the city, Victoria Langley had dinner on autopilot, ordered by her assistant, plated by someone who knew how to present food like an experience. She ate with a polished indifference that had been honed by years of high-stakes negotiation and the necessity of conserving personal resources. She took her coat off with ritual and set it on a hook by the door, the act of removing layers like a carefully performed bearing. That night, she found herself replaying the dojo scene in miniature. The janitor's technique lodged like a foreign object in a machine that did not expect friction. She thought about leverage and about the kind of people who applied force to everything. She did not like being surprised. Yet she could not dislodge the sense that she had watched something rare. A man who chose a different currency of power. She did not know the janitor's name. The idea of someone who had once been called Phantom and now swept floors was not a construction she would have made. She had a checklist in her head of what to do here. Schedule a meeting with the philanthropy director, find the PR angle, get an expert's opinion. Yet beneath those pragmatic motions, an odd discomfort had lodged, one she could not immediately rationalize. She liked clarity, and the dojo had offered no neat answers. The next morning, the clip had spread beyond the gym's walls. The video did what short attention spans do. It ignited a flurry of commentary. Some praised the janitor as a secret hero who had taught humility. Others framed it as a stunt. Others, crueler, made jokes about a janitor winning at life. Threads grew like vines. A local blogger asked for a follow-up and then for an interview. The dojo fielded calls from parents and a producer. Underneath it all was a question whether a man who had once known the cheers of the crowd could step back into any life he had walked from. Grant kept his phone in his pocket like a live coal. He was not immune to the attention. It stirred the complex of fear and resolve in his chest. He thought of Jack again, of the abrupt soundlessness that followed. He thought of Piper's hair tangles and the small boy who had once tied his laces for him. He thought of how easily a life built to protect could be exposed by a single viral moment. Mira's offer spread outward in small, practical ways. They set up a winter outreach program. Some donated time, some donated gloves. Parents signed their children up for lessons in controlled force and awareness. Tyler's following thinned as some students drifted to the more measured discipline Grant preached. Tyler reacted with a curated anger and a series of apologies that landed like clumsy steps. Some of the dojo's older students watched the shift and adjusted in their own time. Victoria returned once, not as a woman who'd be won over by a social media narrative, but as someone who watched recruits sign in, who stood in the back this time like a collector in an exhibition, cataloging what she saw.
The warmth of small things, Piper handing out gloves with a grin, Grant correcting a kid's footwork with a quiet touch, arranged themselves into a pattern that did not care for the ledger she kept. She found herself talking to Mira one evening in the quiet between classes. They stood near the picked-up sneakers and the rolled wrestling mats, the sounds of the city and the thud of a ball beyond the door. "Your program is a rare thing," she said, surprising both herself and Mira by speaking plainly. "It's disciplined. It's real." Mira smiled and brushed a stray hair from her face. "It's a place where people learn how to be strong without breaking each other," she said. "We could use support." Victoria heard the word as if rendered on paper, support. She thought of committees and foundation grants and the staged images that comforted donors. She thought of why she had come in the first place, check boxes and optics. But something in her, not an emotion she'd be comfortable with, but a shifting of priorities close to the bone, nudged toward offering something different. She paused, the way a machine that is always run on one fuel pauses when presented with another. "I'll arrange funds," she said finally, "for equipment. And I'd like to understand what you teach. I'll come to some sessions, not for anything but learning." Mira's gratitude was immediate and uncomplicated. "That would be. Thank you." Victoria's agreement wasn't a surrender to sentiment, it was a new data point on a map of possibilities. She had grown up with a family that taught love as a form of duty. You helped when the ledger required you to, and you retreated when the meeting ended. Allowing herself to visit something gritty and real was not a betrayal to her upbringing, but a curiosity given permission to exist. Grant didn't know yet that a woman with a winter coat and carefully guarded eyes had circled the periphery of her life like an incautious tide. He was focused on teaching, on the linings of lessons he wanted to pass on to kids who liked to test their edges. He was making a plan, to say the things out loud that had been kept tucked in the silence. He would tell them about timing and about how to stop emotion before it grew into damage. He would tell them about restraint, which he had learned with more blood than he wished to admit. He would teach respect that was earned through service. He had to choose what boundaries he would keep and which doors he might open. One evening after class, Grant swept the mat with smaller, more deliberate strokes. The phone of a student had recorded the lesson. No falling this time, just a patient explanation of how to bend at the knees to absorb force and not to brace. He explained to a group of 12-year-olds how to plant the rear foot to create a stable base. He spoke of timing and of how even a small shift of a shoulder could mean the difference between an argument and an accident. He narrated technique like a storyteller, and the kids drank it in because they liked how things worked. From the doorway, Victoria watched him instruct. The edges of her gloves were softened from frequent use. She had begun staying longer than scheduled, not for photo ops, but because the scenes of ordinary discipline planted themselves in her. She had started to notice the quality of his attention to each child, the way he would correct a wrist with a hand that did not humiliate, only aligned. She caught herself imagining a life where one's power was the ability to make others safe, and it felt like something unfamiliar and desirable. When he finished, the smallest student in the class, Cole, a kid with a crooked smile, approached and kissed the edge of Grant's hand in a gesture learned from a grandmother. He looked up as if to ask, "How do you know?" Grant thought of Jack, but did not let the thought displace the present. He felt, in that small moment, a kind of repair. He had not decided what the future would be. He had only decided that he would act with the care of a man who had seen firsthand what happens when care is absent. For Piper, that was everything. Outside, the December wind had the sound of anticipation. The city prepared for holidays with its insistence on lights and noise. Somewhere in that buzz, Victoria returned to her world of meetings and spreadsheets and curated philanthropy. But the dojo had made an impression. She had watched a man handle other people's aggressive energy like someone who had learned an older lesson, that true mastery is measured by what you refuse to use. A phone notification chimed in Grant's jacket. Another clip had surfaced, this time edited to focus on a line from Mira about discipline. Comments piled up. For every person who saw a teacher, another saw an old fighter still marked by ghosts. That binary sat inside him like gravel, something that made walking forward uneven at times. He thought of leaving the past wholly behind, and knew that was impossible. The past could be acknowledged, learned from, and even used to make a different kind of life. He wanted to teach kids to redirect anger before it became hurt. He wanted to give them something that had been given to him only after a price had been extracted. He wanted for Piper a life that did not require watching her father relive mistakes to keep her safe. Outside, the December wind had the sound of anticipation. The city prepared for holidays with its insistence on lights and noise. Somewhere in that buzz, Victoria returned to her world of meetings and spreadsheets and curated philanthropy. But the dojo had made an impression. She had watched a man handle other people's aggressive energy like someone who had learned an older lesson, that true mastery is measured by what you refuse to use. A phone notification chimed in Grant's jacket. Another clip had surfaced, this time edited to focus on a line from Mira about discipline. Comments piled up. For every person who saw a teacher, another saw an old fighter still marked by ghosts. That binary sat inside him like gravel, something that made walking forward uneven at times. He thought of leaving the past wholly behind, and knew that was impossible. The past could be acknowledged, learned from, and even used to make a different kind of life. He wanted to teach kids to redirect anger before it became hurt. He wanted to give them something that had been given to him only after a price had been extracted. He wanted for Piper a life that did not require watching her father relive mistakes to keep her safe. As the lights in the dojo winked off one by one, Victoria's car cut a track of light through an otherwise ordinary street. She thought about what the night had shown her. A man who had taught a lesson without theater. A child who believed in secret crowns. A teacher who had chosen to make the world safer rather than proving he could still break it. It was the kind of quiet demonstration that did not flatter her usual appetite for spectacle. It suggested a choice she might make but had not yet had the language to articulate. Grant closed up for the night and walked home with Piper's small homework folder tucked under his arm. They stopped at the park where strings of tinsel had been hung like a less competent moon. He watched Piper watch the lights with a rapture open and unbothered. She handed him a paper snowflake she had made in school and insisted he hold it like something fragile. He folded it into his wallet, a gesture toward permanence that was both silly and sacramental. Across the city, the seed of attention planted by a fall and a filmed hand grew roots in the soil of rumor and kindness. Grant could not foresee which direction the current would take. He only knew he would teach the lesson he believed in: timing over force, restraint over dominance. He would teach children how to stop an argument before it became a scrape, how to ground their weight so another boy didn't fall like Jack had. He would teach them that strong hands could hold, not hurt. If there was an arc of redemption to be had, it would not be a neat one. Redemption, he had learned, arrived in slow increments. An apology offered and sometimes received. A child's trust earned and kept. A question asked and answered honestly. He was inching toward that life, teaching in small increments, protecting his daughter, and learning to accept help when it came. When Victoria turned the corner that led up to her building, her phone buzzed. An email from the foundation's PR assistant requested a meeting to plan a holiday initiative. She paused, thumb hovering as if the decision itself were a hinge. The dojo hummed in her mind like a patient chorus continuing without applause. Something in her had been pried loose of a certainty she had relied on for years. She tapped a quick affirmative and slid the phone into her pocket as if this small choice mattered more than any boardroom strategy. And for the first time in months, Grant slept without dreaming of hospitals. He woke to Piper's small fist nudging his shoulder and the smell of cinnamon toast burning in the pan. Winter had a way of both exposing and preserving, like cold that sharpened the air but kept things from spoiling. He would teach tomorrow.
He would sweep the mat, plant a lesson, and perhaps more than one parent would feel the honest relief of seeing a child learn how to hold themselves in a crowded, eager world.
He did not know, then, that the clip would find people who wanted to see him differently. Nor did he know which of those people would choose to step further into the things the dojo offered. He only held the small, present truth. His daughter slept under one small roof with her father, who had learned to restrain violence because he had watched its cost. That truth tethered him like an anchor. Outside, the city practiced its own rituals of light and noise, and Victoria Langley rehearsed a meeting time in her mind. The two worlds, one smelling of sweat and rubber mats, the other of wool coats and curated lists, hung near each other like parallel tracks. For now, they simply observed and responded in small ways, neither entirely certain whether their paths would merge or diverge. The next morning, the dojo filled faster than usual. There were new faces and a few cameras in the corners professionals had deemed tasteful. Mira stood near the door with a clipboard, eyes brighter and more anxious than her usual composure allowed. A handful of parents lingered, whispering about the piece they'd seen online. Tyler hovered at the edge, trying to reclaim the comfort of his old protagonist role. Grant's palms settled around the edge of a mitt while he moved through the ritual of warm-ups like a man who had recovered an old language but spoke it with new intent. Piper sat at the side with her chin in her hands, watching, like every child watches the way someone they love navigates the world. She had homework half complete in a folder at her feet and a thermos of cocoa her mother, no, the friend who sometimes helped with babysitting, had tucked into a bag. She had an elastic in her hair and a determination that made Grant's chest full and heavy. He would teach that day, and the day after, and the week that followed. He would watch each kid's face for the moment understanding arrived, the way a small pupil in a classroom brightens when a concept clicks. He would correct hands and hips and knees with touches that were firm but kind. He would refuse to let the children leave thinking that strength meant breaking someone else. He would tell them, in small, unadorned phrases, how to stop emotion before it became a mistake. After the first block of classes, when the dozen new faces filtered into the cold air outside, Grant found Mira waiting with a small cup of coffee for him, old habit for people who ran small businesses. He took it without ceremony and then walked outside, the cold wind shaping their breath into miniature clouds. If you're drawn to stories of quiet strength and second chances, hit subscribe, Mira said, half joking but with the sincere practicality of someone who knew the power of community. Her words were a small ad in the marketplace of human connection, an offer of belonging in place of spectacle. Grant smiled at the improbable charity of it and felt Piper's hand find his. He knew the road ahead would be messy. Tyler's ego, the clip's aftershocks, the constant negotiation of privacy and exposure. But he also saw the small bright things, the children learning, Piper's grin, a woman in a wool coat who had offered a simple, clean support. They walked back inside together, the sound of the door thudding like a heart. The lesson for the day was simple and exacting. Learn where to stop. Learn how to be strong enough not to use your strength. There was, Grant felt in the hollow of his chest, a small room of certainty. Timing mattered. The rest could wobble, but if he taught a child to find the beat between motion and reaction, fewer people would fall wrong. He swept the mat slowly, as if the rhythm of the broom could shape a life into steadiness. Winter settled into the city in honest layers. Sleet one day, soft snow the next, a wind that found seams and tugged scarves open. The dojo's winter outreach grew teeth. More kids, more coats, more questions. Victoria kept coming. Each visit unspooled something less like assignment and more like curiosity turned habit. She arrived early sometimes, standing in the doorway until the fluorescent lights warmed the mats, watching with the same measured attention she gave to board reports but without the insulation of certainty. One evening, after a session of patience drills and partner work, Victoria stayed to help fold donated sweaters. Her gloves were off, her hands looked small against the thick fabric. Piper darted across the mats like a sparrow and planted herself near Victoria, an electric, fearless presence.
She offered the heiress a paper crown. Piper had not yet learned the difference between the kinds of crowns the world made and the ones you wore for imaginary courts, then sat down and began to explain, as only a 10-year-old can, the correct way to wool wrap a pair of mittens. Victoria listened. She had been taught, from an early age, to listen in a particular register, composed, clinically curious, drawing lessons for decisions. This listening was different. It had the soft bluntness of a child's curiosity. "Why do you come?" Piper asked her, as if asking where clouds went when they slipped behind a building. Victoria took a moment, the pause of someone measuring the weight of a confession. She wrapped a scarf twice around and handed it to Piper. "Because," she said, surprising herself with a small honesty, "someone told me to come. Then I watched. Then I thought, maybe I should come where things are messy and real for a while." Piper's face lit as if a small sun had been carved out of the question to make room for play. "Sometimes messy is the best," she pronounced with the authority of a judge. Victoria let out a sound that might have been a laugh. It softened the line around her mouth in a way that made Grant look up from the mitt he was repairing. He'd been tightening a seam with a small needle and patience that came from doing such minor tasks for years. The room felt, for a sliver of time, like a place where walls could be moved. That night, after the gym closed and the coats were stacked and labeled, Victoria did something she had not planned to do. She invited Grant to one of the foundation breakfasts. It was the sort of meeting where introductions were practiced and stories assigned. Grant refused the first time. He disliked meetings and disliked the spotlight more. But she persisted with an economy of gentleness that did not need his agreement to register. "Come sit with me," she said. "No cameras, just breakfast." He agreed because the notion of a small breakfast with a woman who had been watching his life felt less invasive than a camera crew. Also because his daughter liked the idea of grown-up breakfasts, a phrase that sounded important to Piper and therefore to him. The breakfast was quieter than he expected, with linen that felt like costume and orange juice that tasted of something filtered through a boardroom. Victoria listened to him describe the winter program with the straightforward, unflashy curiosity that now seemed to attach to her. He said, without theatricality, that discipline taught at the dojo was about stopping, about setting a hand on an elbow and redirecting the force before it hurt someone. She asked, gently and without morality, "How do you do that after Jack?" Grant felt the ground open for a moment. He knew this question would come when she peeled back her curated indifference. He had rehearsed it in his private nights, phrases that would be true but not theatrical. He did not want to be padded or heroized. He wanted to be heard with the practical care of someone who might one day stand beside the work without claiming credit. He told her simply that the accident had been a timing error, a misread, a flinch in the place it should not have been. He told her the detail that he had refused to embroider, the sound of bones and the way Jack's eyes had gone from bright to not there in a breath. He told her about the quiet days afterward, of the paperwork and the silence, of the nights he had taken the long way to keep the city from cornering him. He told her finally that leaving the sport had been a vow, to make sure whatever skill he had would become a brake, not a weapon. Victoria listened. Her expression did not swerve into pity. Instead, it gathered something like respect. "You made a choice," she said. "You traded one kind of life for another that cost you more than it gave you back." "Yes," Grant said, "and it's still costing me." They sat in the aftermath of the sentence like people who had stepped off a moving conveyor and were trying to find a bench. Victoria reached for a napkin without realizing it, folding it twice and then placing it on the table like a small monument to a civility she was learning to call honest. "It matters that you stayed," she said finally. "Not for me, but for the kids who come here." It mattered in ways neither of them could quite grasp. For Piper, for the kids who would one day know how to stop themselves. For the town that liked tidy narratives but sometimes needed messy ones to learn compassion. As the weeks passed, Victoria's presence became a steadying light rather than an intrusion. She worked in the afternoons for the foundation as much as she could, and sometimes stayed late to help sort gear. She attended sessions not to sit in judgment, but to learn technique. How to place a shoulder, how to redirect momentum without inflicting harm. And she surprised everyone by priding herself on the small things. Being punctual, learning names, asking awkward but genuine questions about the lives of people she'd never had to serve. Her own home life peeled back slowly. In pieces, she let him see that her father had taught her that attention could be earned in exchange for obedience, that affection was a currency measured in returns. Family dinners were exercises in negotiation. Love had been an obligation, not a refuge. She had been praised for good decisions and ignored for private failures, trained to avoid the rawness of feelings because feelings undermine the economy of enterprise. This is why she had learned to build a coat of exactness. It kept others from pressing at the places that hurt. Grant did not fix the family grammar she came from. He only listened and sometimes offered a version of warmth that came from the plain fact of sharing tasks. He could not promise her conversion, only the steadiness of a man who had decided to use his hands for repair rather than harm. Tyler's trajectory was less tidy. The outrage he felt when his fall had been shared rippled through every interaction. He tried, at first, to reclaim his swagger. Louder commands, staged demonstrations, flashier moves. But parents and many of the kids preferred the steadier lesson. Tyler lost a number of students, and it struck him in a place he hadn't counted on: his identity. Without the applause, he felt naked. There were low, bruised days, but there was also a capacity for correction in him, slow and awkward. One snowy evening, when a donated van arrived late and the volunteers were short-handed, Tyler was the first to offer to haul boxes. He moved with an apologetic clumsiness that turned into something like humility. He sat with kids who struggled at drills and allowed himself to be corrected by a former rival. He learned, not all at once, but in a visible arc, how to teach restraint because it was useful, not because it made him the center of attention. He apologized to Grant in a room that smelled of disinfectant and old rubber. It came out rough and half-baked, the apology of someone who knew words would not do the work, but had to say them anyway. He began. I was a jerk. I thought the sound of me mattered.
Marcus ended up facing Grant, cheeks hot with adrenaline, breathing hard. The other boy, still unsteady, held onto the stand, and then, with a small shame, found his balance. "You okay?" Grant asked the other boy, and then Marcus, and his voice carried a steadiness that said, "Anger is a thing you can learn to move through." This was not theatrical, no heroics, no knockout blow. It was the practice of conversion, an applied technique, lost energy redirected. Alexander's term would have been leverage, a precise adjustment of footwork, a palm on a shoulder to guide, not to punish. The crowd felt relief, as if it had been waiting for permission to exhale. Victoria watched from the crowd with a furrowed softness. The scene had the effect of undoing two stories at once: the grand narrative of the fighter's violence and the heiress's cold detachment. Here was a man using his knowledge to prevent harm, and here was a woman who had been trained to keep feelings tidy, finally seeing what uncurated warmth could do. The crisis passed without blood or spectacle. Later, as volunteers handed out warm wraps and the small stage played carols at a decibel level set to be companionable rather than triumphal, Victoria found a moment with Grant. They stood near a pile of donated blankets as snow started again in slow, courteous flakes. "You do this," she said, voice small, as if naming the obvious was an act of courage, "because you promised Jack you would stop hurting people?" Grant looked at the falling snow and then at Piper, who was scattering candy canes among a ring of children. "I promised Jack I'd stop the mistakes I could stop," he answered, "and I promised myself to teach how to stop before it becomes one." She nodded. Her fingers, without fully deciding to, brushed the edge of his sleeve. "You could probably teach a lot of boardrooms to do the same," she said with a rueful lift of her mouth. "They'd be better off." He smiled at that. A brief, honest thing. Maybe, but the kids here need it more. Christmas came with a low hum of expectation and ordinary wonders.
The dojo decorated its windows with paper snowflakes and twinkling strands. Mirrored bulbs made little suns on the mats. The charity festival had become an annual thing, and this year it included a small benefit dinner hosted in a small floor of the dojo where the older students had cleared mats and strung lights. It was intimate enough that nobody felt trampled, and loud enough that people who wanted to be seen had room. Victoria had arranged for a modest choir from one of her foundation's community programs to sing at the event. She had also, quietly and without much fanfare, pledged a scholarship that would fund after-school training for several kids. She did not make a speech about grand transformation. She handed envelopes to Mira and asked for discretion. Her gesture was public because the checks cleared and the lists recorded it, but she kept the rhetoric minimal. Christmas came with a low hum of expectation and ordinary wonders. The dojo decorated its windows with paper snowflakes and twinkling strands. Mirrored bulbs made little suns on the mats. The charity festival had become an annual thing, and this year it included a small benefit dinner hosted in a small floor of the dojo where the older students had cleared mats and strung lights. It was intimate enough that nobody felt trampled, and loud enough that people who wanted to be seen had room. Victoria had arranged for a modest choir from one of her foundation's community programs to sing at the event. She had also, quietly and without much fanfare, pledged a scholarship that would fund after-school training for several kids. She did not make a speech about grand transformation. She handed envelopes to Mira and asked for discretion. Her gesture was public because the checks cleared and the lists recorded it, but she kept the rhetoric minimal.
For her, it was a small, useful choice. That night, an unexpected complication arose. The storm intensified, and a tree limb fell across the main bus route. Several volunteers were delayed. A delivery of food for the shelter was stuck in traffic. For a tense hour, they rearranged plans. A handful of elderly people who had been scheduled to be bused to a municipal hall arrived at the dojo because they had walked or someone had helped them. They were cold and tired and confused. A nervousness bubbled under the surface of everything, a human wobble that wanted reshaping into calm. Grant moved with a manager's quiet. He organized people into a rotation. Hot drinks at a table near the mats, blankets around chairs, a volunteer to keep the coffee hot, another to register names, Piper to be the kid doing good who handed out cookies. He delegated with the ease of someone who had practiced carrying weight without making it heavy for others. Victoria found herself in the thick of things. She sat with an old woman named Ruth who kept apologizing for wearing the wrong shoes. Victoria sat on a stack of boxes and listened as Ruth told stories of winters in a house that had no heat, and a father who had told her at 16 that practical people did not wallow. Victoria did not tell Ruth she was wealthy. She did not speak about trusteeships or ledgers. She put her scarf around Ruth's shoulders and squeezed. "You kept going," she said, and it was less grand than it sounded. It was an observation, tender and true. After the storm passed and the last person was accounted for, there was a pause. The room smelled of cinnamon and steam and the iron of 1,000 small deeds done. People shivered and then forgot to. They sat in a warmth that had nothing to do with electricity and everything to do with the practice of showing up for each other. Outside, snow turned the city into a softened blueprint. They closed the mats and began to pull together the remaining boxes. The volunteers dispersed in pairs. Tyler, who had been carrying hot chocolate boxes, offered to clear the walkways. He was rough-handed and earnest, arms full of the practical things that constitute contrition. It was after all this that the moment came, quiet and private, a hinge that had been forming for weeks. Grant stepped out to the stoop for a breath of cold air. He found Victoria already there, hands thrust into the pockets of a plain coat she had borrowed from a volunteer when the foundation's chauffeurs could not manage the side streets. Her cheeks were bright from the cold. Her hair had escaped its structure. She was not the woman in a perfectly tailored coat standing at a distance. She was, in small and humiliatingly attractive, human. They watched the snow for a moment. Piper was inside, handing out cookies with a diplomatic energy, her paper crown improbably at an angle. She looked, in Grant's estimation,
like a prize that had nothing to do with trophies and everything to do with fierce, ongoing care. "Thank you," Victoria said, finally, and the words were not for publicity or for Foundation minutes. They were simply human. "For everything tonight." He shrugged in the small way he had when things felt like they were being made larger than they were. "We did what had to be done." "No," she corrected gently. "You did what had to be done, and you did it well." A silence settled between them like a careful curtain. It held possible intimacies, friendship, trust, something that could be named love someday. It also held sharp things: his past, her family's expectations, Piper's small, fierce world. They had been careful all along to avoid turning their small alliance into a melodrama. This was still, he reminded himself, merely two people who had learned to protect and to let themselves be seen. Victoria fiddled with the edge of a mitten and then did something simple and brave. She stepped closer, the air slightly colder where she was moving, and reached out with one gloved hand to take his. It was not a theatrical reaching, nor a possessive claim. It was testing the water, an action that asked permission without words. Grant looked at her hand on his, and then at her face. There was an answering softness there he had not seen before, a small bravery that had nothing to do with money. "You could go back to where it was safe," he said softly, "because honesty, always, had to be part of any beginning. You won't be the person your family expects." She smiled, a micro thing that unfolded quickly. "Maybe I don't want to be what they expect." Then, quieter, "May I kiss you?" The question landed with an almost physical gravity. It was the most direct offer of consent he had ever heard. It made the moment clear and mutual. Grant could have, at that point, taken a different path. He could have insisted on more time, more proofs, but the thing he felt was not a simple desire. It was recognition. He had been guarding his heart for years to protect his child and to atone for a past mistake. He had also been teaching children to trust guidance. The paradox of the night was that trust, not isolation, would be the better teacher. "Yes," he answered, "if you want to." She removed one glove, then the other, a little clumsily, as if the act of making herself vulnerable required fumbling. Her hand found his, fingers threading into a shape that had been practiced in private and now performed openly. Their faces moved closer with the small mutual negotiation of people who wanted the other to be willing. Outside, a flake of snow landed on his cheek and melted. Piper, inside, laughed at something ridiculous and bright. The kiss was a soft thing that made no claims other than this: two people choosing warmth. It was not a prize bestowed, nor a tidy culmination.
It was an exchange, an affirmation that scars could lead to gentler hands, that wealth could choose to be useful, that promises could be made not only by leaving, but by leaning in. It sealed nothing and opened everything. When they pulled away, it was with a steadier breath. Victoria rested her forehead against his for a moment, as if making the moment secret in the only way two people can hold secrets, by sharing them. She did not announce a plan. He did not offer a pledge of fairy tales. They walked back in together and found Piper waiting at the door, eyes wide and triumphant, as if she had been the tiny architect of the evening's happiness. "You two looked," Piper said with a judicial nod, as if she had been presiding over the ceremony. "You lit up like someone hung a crown on you." Their laughter was a small, honest sound that echoed in the mat room. The remainder of the night was ordinary in a way Grant had learned to cherish: folding blankets, loading vans, a hand on Piper's hair. The Christmas kiss had not erased the work that remained, the teaching, the atonement, the careful life-building, but it had laid down a beginning that was mutual and chosen. Months later, the dojo hummed with a new routine. Tyler had become a man who asked questions and listened for answers. He ran mornings where he practiced the gentle parts of the art, the redirections and holds that prevented injuries. He had apologized to families and was slowly rebuilding trust.
Grant's classes were fuller, and a scholarship fund, quietly administered through Victoria's foundation, paid for gear and tutoring. The city noticed less as the arc of the story bent away from the viral clip and into the sturdier narrative of consistent work. Victoria took a public stand one afternoon that surprised her family. She canceled a gala speech that would have featured her in a manufactured celebration and instead spoke at a modest town hall about the importance of community-based care. She did not frame the speech as a conversion. She spoke of choices and of the need to put resources where they made a difference, even if that meant fewer polished photographs. Her family grumbled in private. She listened without flinching. Grant and Victoria took slow steps forward. She learned the small economies of his life, how to run a kettle without burning it, how to fold Piper's paper crowns into shapes that lasted more than a day. Piper, who liked the heiress with an untroubled affection, taught Victoria to braid hair and to choose the right kind of thermos. On weekends, the three of them walked the park with scarves tucked into pockets, trading stories. They visited Jack's grave together one soft afternoon. Victoria placed a small poinsettia beside the plastic one Grant had left before. She did not speak of her wealth or her family's expectations. She only stood there, hand on Grant's shoulder, allowing the moment to be, and that was enough.
The community healed, not in a single sweep, but in the small daily acts. The way Tyler stopped preening and began to teach better, the way children learned to use strength as a shield rather than a weapon, the way donors funded MITs instead of PR. People began to expect less spectacle and more reliability. The dojo's mat became a place where mistakes were acknowledged and then turned into practical lessons, where apologies were taught the same way as wrist alignment. On a smaller scale, Grant learned the discipline of letting someone close without bracing for catastrophe. He had been careful for years because carelessness had cost a life. Learning to risk tenderness was not easy, but it was necessary for Piper's future, and she found the changes both gentle and exhilarating. She began to sleep with a pencil behind her ear and a stack of folded paper crowns next to her pillow. She began to draw champions without armor, figures shaped by hands, not trophies. Her pride in her father was quiet and fierce. She talked about him in school as if he were a myth made small and therefore more believable. They marked 1 year since the first viral clip with a small celebration at the dojo. Mira invited people who had been part of the outreach, volunteers, parents, the kids themselves. Victoria arranged for soup to be served from a kitchen manned by corporate interns who had been put to work in a practical program. Tyler read a short piece he had written about pride and the cost of losing sight of others. It was a humble, human evening, with candles in mason jars and carols sung out of tune and loud and beautiful. After the last guest had left, Grant and Victoria sat on the mats and watched Piper rearrange the paper crowns into a city. Victoria leaned her head on Grant's shoulder and he put his arm around her. "You kept your promise to teach," she said, as if noting a fact. "And you let someone in." He kissed her temple, an answer that was both small and large. "I kept several promises," he said, "to Jack, to myself, to Piper, and now, I guess, to you." She smiled. "We're messy," she said, and it was said like an invitation rather than a condemnation. "But I like messy." The dojo glowed with a warm light in the winter night, a small domestic planet orbiting in a city that was sometimes indifferent. Outside, snow fell in gentle, patient flakes. Inside, people were practicing the hardest kinds of work, repairing dignity, learning how to redirect force, choosing authenticity over optics. The Christmas kiss had not been the end of anything. It had been a promise made in small, mutual terms, that two people had decided to step off their brittle ledgers and into each other's messy, ordinary lives. It had been the point where the heiress chose to risk warmth, where the janitor allowed his heart to be seen. She smiled. "We're messy," she said, and it was said like an invitation rather than a condemnation. "But I like messy." The dojo glowed with a warm light in the winter night, a small domestic planet orbiting in a city that was sometimes indifferent.
Outside, snow fell in gentle, patient flakes. Inside, people were practicing the hardest kinds of work, repairing dignity, learning how to redirect force, choosing authenticity over optics. The Christmas kiss had not been the end of anything. It had been a promise made in small, mutual terms, that two people had decided to step off their brittle ledgers and into each other's messy, ordinary lives. It had been the point where the heiress chose to risk warmth, where the janitor allowed his heart to be seen. It had been Piper's coronation of two people she loved into a makeshift family that would be judged not by rings or titles, but by the meals they shared, the cold nights they endured together, and the steady practice of showing up. As spring edged into the city months later, the dojo hosted a new class, adults who'd never had a chance to learn restraint, a group of men and women with hands roughened by other kinds of work. Grant taught with the same measured voice. Victoria sat in the back sometimes, not as an heiress observing from a distance, but as someone who had learned to be present without performance. Tyler was there too, setting up cones, offering a grin that had more humility in it than swagger. Piper, now taller and fiercer, assisted at the sign-in table with a solemnity that made people smile. And in a small cemetery on the edge of the city, Grant left a fresh poinsettia on Jack's stone as the sun set late one cool afternoon. This time, beside it, a second poinsettia stood, Victoria's small, careful emblem. He spoke his small sentence aloud, for the record and for himself. "I'm trying." He folded the words not into absolution, but into an ongoing practice. They would continue to make mistakes. They would still learn the hard lesson of being careful. But the pattern had changed. Rather than hiding in shame or lashing out, they named their faults and then worked, in the daily disciplines of teaching, listening, and loving, to do better. Strength, as Grant had kept saying, was the ability to stop. Leadership, he had learned to say more and more, was the willingness to lift others, not to bow others beneath your feet. On a winter evening much like the first, the three of them, Grant, Piper, and Victoria, sat at their small kitchen table and passed a bowl of soup between their hands. Piper proclaimed that they were a very proud family and asked if they could hang the paper crowns in the window. Tyler stopped by, now a friend who sometimes dropped off extra gloves. Mira visited new students and brought news of kids who had turned their lives around. The city, always hungry for a neat story, had to settle for the duller, truer thing, the slow work of people learning how to stand for one another. If someone came to the dojo years from then and asked which moment changed everything, no single clip would own the credit. It would be the cumulative work of small decisions, the kindness of handing out a coat, the discipline of teaching a child to stop emotion before it hurts, the bravery of a woman stepping away from a ledger and into a busy room, the humility of a man learning to apologize and begin again. The Christmas kiss would be remembered not as a trophy, but as the gentle hinge between past and future, a small, consenting act that announced the possibility of warmth.
If you were drawn to this story of quiet strength and second chances, if it warmed something inside you, consider sharing it with someone who needs to believe that redemption is possible and that love sometimes arrives wrapped in ordinary tasks. If you want to follow more stories like this, a simple subscribe helps us tell them. They kept their lives messy, deliberate, and kind. The dojo's lights stayed on late into the evenings, a small promise to anyone who needed one. There is a place where people learn to stop and then to hold, not to break.